Evening and welcome back. So, as the protests continue on, we have more news from the disgraced former member of SAGE, Professor Ferguson, suggesting that the earlier lockdown would have halved death toll, while of course others are concerned with getting on with their regular life in terms of trying to redefine words so that it suits people better. Because I'm sure you remember this back to the whole sexism and feminism debacle in using dictionary definition, and at that time, of course, the response is, well, the dictionary is descriptive, not prescriptive. That is to say that the dictionary says how words are used, not how they should be used, and accordingly needs to be updated every so often in order to keep things aligned with common parlance. Slight difference here, though, because we're all racist, don't you know? All white people, definitely, and saying you're not racist isn't enough because you have to be actively doing things, and I really can't keep up. That seeing as Merriam-Webster got an email from a young black woman asking to change the definition of racism, then of course you'd expect, oh god, this racist patriarchy, well of course they're not going to listen to her. But no, instead she got a response the next day saying, yeah, you want to include systemic, we'll do that. We'll put in a couple of example sentences as well to elaborate on our second definition, which at the moment is a doctrine or political program based on the assumption of racism and designed to execute its principles, and B, a political or social system founded on racism. So yes, they will definitely bring that in as the key guy in making this decision. The editorial manager, Peter Sokolowski, told the BBC that the wording of the second definition of racism will be even more clear on our next release. It could be expanded to include the term systemic, and it will certainly have one or two example sentences at least. As Ms. Mitchum said, the issue of definition is vital. I think it's very important for people to be on the same page. And yes, but the idea is to keep changing the goalposts and to keep virtue signalling into your virtue spiral, your spiral of decline, your purity spiral, in order to push other people out so that other people cannot be included, so that you can always claim to be the more righteous one and use that to beat them over the head with it. That is the tactic that is always used and will continue to be so. So it is never to be on the same page. It is instead just to divide. Obviously not going for equality, that was achieved quite some time ago, but instead going for supremacy. But the coronavirus is still in the news, and Professor Neil Ferguson would like to be back in the news. Hopefully people have forgotten about why he left beforehand for breaching his own guidelines, but then saying, hey, I was wrong. I made a mistake. I said you shouldn't do this, and I did it. And it was for adulterous behaviour as well, which just compounds the issue, something that used to be illegal as well. And therefore I'll step down. You won't hear from me, don't worry. Unfortunately, no, they will still hear from him, saying the number of coronavirus deaths in the UK would have been halved if lockdown had been introduced just a week earlier. A former government advisor has said, yep. Professor Neil Ferguson. At this point, I think it's probably important to say who it was. We do know who so-called Professor Lockdown is. So the idea is that, of course, it's exponential, that it can double in less than a week. And therefore, if you bring lockdown in earlier, you then flatten the curve, as they say. You then stop that doubling, and therefore you halve the amount of people who have died. That's the idea. They do, though, try to say that, although obviously we hate the Conservatives and will give the BBC anything they want in order to push them down, we will also try to be more fair and say hindsight's 2020. You can't know what to do at the start of something. You have a much better view of it looking back. But if we had instigated the lockdown earlier, because different studies had different weight to them of how the government received them, essentially, and there's too much weighting instead of trying to view things in terms of what is scientifically accurate. As we have here, the mathematician Kit Yates said there had been an over-reliance on certain models, and some members of Pandemic Modelling Group, SPIM, have communicated their concerns to me that some of the modelling groups had more influence over the consensus decisions than others. This meant some opinions or estimates that may have been valid didn't get passed on up the chain. And that works both ways, of course. We know that, of course, Sweden decided to follow a different model than the UK and Spain. And the result of that, the fallout, if you will, we see Spain, for example, with how they've been affected. So the cases overview now is 242,000 confirmed cases, 150,000 recovered, 27,000 deaths. In other countries, of course, Sweden being the go-to, 46,000 confirmed cases, 5,000 deaths. And their spike is in a different place as well. We got the 3rd of June instead of back in the middle of March. But of course, their spike that equals it would have been about 2 weeks before Sweden. And then just to compare it again against another country that didn't lock down, we've got Japan with 17,000 confirmed cases, 15,000 recovered, and just under 1,000 deaths. So they seem to have really done okay for themselves. But some put it down to mask wearing, that is more of the culture. Others say it's because they're just healthier people, that they have a remarkably low rate of obesity. I mean, in a way, it's illegal to be obese in Japan. If your waist size for a man is over 34 inches, I believe it is, which is lower than the average in America, then the employer has to pay a tax until the employee is thin again. Kind of a way to try and do a national health insurance that is more targeted, so it does cover everybody, but it does cost more if you're in a higher risk group, not just on income, but instead if you're at higher risk. Like insurance should work, basically, that it can take in those individual factors. Things like that. And they don't have the contact tracing that they did, that other countries did, of course, but instead they just let people go outside, and it seemed to actually be okay. Bear in mind that even from a place like Al Jazeera, which is, of course, trying to say that the protests are good, as they're saying that their framing is ridiculous. An unarmed black man who was pinned to the ground by a white police officer of Minneapolis, the officer who has since been fired and charged for murder, knelt on Floyd's neck for nearly 9 minutes as Floyd pleaded, "I can't breathe." Oh, it sounds terrible. The protests sound like they're justified, except that isn't really what happened. So almost as if you're stoking the flames to try and end civilization. So this, of course, happened only a couple of weeks ago on the 25th of May, and the protest happened after that. Normally there's about a 2-week lag, so we'd only just really be getting in the results from whether or not these protests did have an effect. The idea of this would be, hey, if shutting down a week earlier would have halved the amount of deaths, then it must be so infectious and so easily to transmit going about in day-to-day life that if people are then closed in such small numbers like they are on protests, then this is going to be horrific in terms of how quickly it increases. Because, of course, these people are all going together, very tightly packed, shoulder to shoulder, and then going back to their own homes, of course. So you'd expect this to spread terribly. Of course, as we scroll through just various places, it hasn't really had any effect. We're mainly looking at the last few bars anyway. And no, it tends to take a few days to develop symptoms anyway, so the first few ones afterwards wouldn't really help. And as they say, if you have not been tested, you are not counted. So, about 95% of people who experience symptoms get them within 14 days. But it can be up to 28, I believe, is the longest measured by the WHO. So they say we also need to account for the delay in getting tested and reported. Furthermore, Maya Lazowski, Associate Professor of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at the University of Cape Town, said, being outdoors certainly reduces the risk of transmission by 20 to 500-fold according to some estimates. So, when they didn't like it before, people saying, we want to be able to work, we want to be able to exercise, we want to be able to go outside because we think the vitamin D is a good idea and fresh air is always good instead of being cooped up inside. Of course, no, you were killing the old people. But now that it is politically expedient for the protests, that, well, don't you know, being outside is 20 to 500 times better than being inside. You should definitely be outside. Okay. I guess going back to what Professor Ferguson was kind of saying, but didn't want to, and reiterated by Kid Yates, of course, is that some of the modelling groups have more influence over the consensus decisions than others. Which means some opinions or estimates that may have been valid didn't get passed on up the chain. And that seems to continue to be happening, and they're just overlooked. But they're also saying, of course, Zosky said, in contrast, the crowding that often happens during mass marches, and especially the response by the police, including the use of tear gas, pepper spray, which are respiratory irritants, and the arrest and incarceration of large numbers of people, are very likely to increase transmission. In which case, we would expect so many more cases, so many more people dying, especially considering, of course, coronavirus is supposed to be a racist disease because it targets unhealthy people, and it seems to be these non-whites, black, Asian, minority, ethnic. It's not going to take too long for them to not be a minority, especially it already is the case in places like London, in which case it makes so much more sense to just say non-white, because that's what they mean. I'm not going to go as far as to say anti-white. No, that's an ideology, not in terms of a descriptor, but non-white. That is then what they're talking about, and they're more likely to have the unhealthy lifestyles, and therefore they're more likely to have died from coronavirus. But the early numbers are coming out, and of course we're seeing that it isn't having any noticeable effect. So, of the 3,141 US counties, 1,400 saw an increase, 1,200 a decrease, 500 the same. Since Memorial Day on May 25th compared to the 15 days before. So, 15 days before, 15 days since. Basically the same, 1,400 to 1,200. Okay, slight difference, so there is a slight increase, but it's not really enough to say this is devastating news. Obviously, they did pick out one of Los Angeles, which has increased noticeably, but that is it. So at the end of the day, it seems to be that this doesn't really have an effect. We can agree that being outside isn't going to kill the old people, and therefore we can do it. And at this point, surely you should just end the lockdown immediately to say, well, if they can do it, then why can't we? Otherwise, you're going to continue to get like churchgoers in America who dress up in order to look like BLM protesters just because they know that the law is applied differently depending on ideological grounds, and therefore if you're protesting for BLM you won't get arrested, but if you're going to church then you will, in which case they pretend that, yeah, we're all for BLM, Black Lives Matter, no wall, yeah, Trump bad, KKK evil, then they know they won't get arrested, and that's what they do. So I think at this point maybe there's a bit too much black supremacy going on, and it's time to even the playing fields. But as always, let me know what you guys think down below, and until next time, have a good one.